Welcome, everybody, to week 4 of Master Your Mind, a mental health moment. And in case you haven't seen the first few, my name is Elizabeth McDowell, and I'm an associate licensed counselor. And I'm excited to announce my special guest for this week, Will Hutcherson. Will, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, excited to have you too. Why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and then we'll kind of introduce our topic for today.
Yeah, so I'm a next gen pastor. I'm based in South Florida, but for the last about 3 years, I've been traveling the country and speaking in middle school and high schools to help kids when they're facing despair, and specifically doing suicide prevention programs, anti bullying programs. My team and I have been partnering with schools, and we've been partnering with parents and churches to try to just help explain a little bit more of what's happening in the brain and how we can help the brain to heal as caring adults and parents in their life.
That's awesome. That's great. And I know a huge part of what you do is suicide prevention. And so that is what we're going to be talking about today, right? So why is that such a big thing just on your heart?
Well, I would say it's a big thing because it's a major issue for teenagers. And
Yeah.
so I've been working with kids and teenagers for about 15 years or so. And as a student of psychology, someone who loves psychology, and I also love Jesus, here I am investing and leading the next generation to know Jesus, but I was starting to see something in their psychology that was at first I was concerned, but then I would say over time, as I saw more and more of the trends, I became alarmed. And when you look at the last 10 years, you start to see suicide rates just drastically have increased and really have doubled. And even last year in October, the highest increase of suicide rates of any demographic was actually between the ages of 10 and 14. And that's from the CDC just last year. So we're continuing to see, really, I would say, a pandemic of despair and these depressive symptoms amongst teenagers that's become quite concerning. And I think the reason why I felt God really leading me to, step out of just the four walls of the church and try to engage and help be a part of the solution is because when you look at America as a whole, the common kind of mindset is, well, there's nothing we can do. As parents, there's nothing we can do. As church leaders, there's nothing we can do. And we just feel powerless, and it's so hard to watch somebody you love go through, despair or have suicidal thoughts and feel powerless.
Yeah.
And what I found is when you really look into the psychology of how God's wired us, is that we're actually not powerless, that there are things that we can do that maybe won't change the overall outcome, but we can help influence and lead the heart and the brain towards healing. And I think that's really good news because there's always
Yes.
hope. And
Yes.
that's the thing, sometimes I get pegged as like, oh, you're the guy that talks about suicide. And I'm like, well, not really. I'm the guy that talks about hope because
I like it.
suicide is
Yes.
a problem, but hope is a solution.
Yes.
And there is always hope. And those who are struggling with despair or those who are having suicidal thoughts, if we can lead them to healthy places, then that really, really matters. And so
Right.
it's been good to kind of be a part of really a movement now that is starting to recognize that this, yes, suicide rates have increased. And yes, we can point the blame. And, sometimes people want to blame, well, it's because of social media or it's because of this or it's because of that. And
Right.
it's like, well, the why doesn't matter as much as the solution. The solution matters even more.
Right.
And God has wired our brains to respond to love and empathy. And that's what matters most.
Yes. I love that. I love that. It's something that we are dealing with in alarming numbers, but there is hope. There's always hope.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that we can always talk about, look to. And that's exactly what we're doing today. It's talking about, okay, so we're struggling with these things. We know someone that's struggling with these things, but what do we do about it? So today
Yeah.
we are talking all about that suicide prevention. We're going to be talking about different myths that surround suicide. And honestly, this is something that I'm passionate about as a counselor because this is something I see all of the time. I would say more clients than not that I see are struggling with some level of suicidal ideation, have had past suicidal attempts, are thinking about it, planning it. It's just something I'm seeing a lot, and especially in young people. And so it's also one of those things that doesn't discriminate. It's suicide a lot of times is something that affects all different kinds of people. It can be popular people, it can be loners, it can be, affluent, whatever it may be. It's just something that affects all kinds of people. And so I think this is just a really important conversation to have, especially in the time that we're in right now, where people are unfortunately isolated. They're cut off from their support. They're not connecting to the places that they usually are, which usually, brings them hope and gives them some of those things that they can look to when unfortunately they start, thinking those kind of thoughts and feeling those kind of feelings too.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is I like to think of it as we've already had a crisis amongst, teenagers and young adults, and really, you could argue every demographic, a mental health crisis. Right. Now you add the crisis of a pandemic that is, right, yes, a physical risk, but it's also not making the mental health pandemic any better. And so these right. are unprecedented times in that regard. And it's so important for us to recognize the things that will promote healing and lead us to healing if we just
Absolutely.
Take some steps.
Absolutely. Yes. Well, let's jump in and talk about just some of the myths that we have both kind of experienced in dealing with this and talking to people about this. So the first one being, if someone talks about committing suicide, they won't actually do it. This is something that I've heard, that if they're talking about it, it's just attention seeking. It's not something that they're really planning on it, because if they weren't talking about it, then they might actually be thinking about it. I feel like that almost doesn't make sense logically, but that's a lot of how people think about it. And unfortunately, a lot of parents that I've talked to as well, whose children are experiencing, suicidal thoughts and behaviors, and they maybe don't necessarily know how to handle it. And they think that it's just kind of an attention seeking behavior, and that's really it. So then they kind of make the choice to ignore it, or downplay it, or just honestly kind of don't know what to do with that. So what would you say about that myth, that if people are talking about it, that they're not going to actually take their lives, or that it's just kind of an attention seeking behavior?
Yeah. Well, I think there's two myths that kind of correlate back and forth. That you have one that's like, well, if they talk about it, they won't commit suicide. Then you have another side that says, well, if we talk about it, we're going to see suicides increase. I see that with schools. When I work with schools, sometimes schools are like, well, we don't want to talk about suicide because we don't want suicides to take place. Well, neither one of those things are true. And I think what's important is to really look at what's actually happening. When somebody says that they are thinking about hurting themselves or killing themselves, what's actually happening in the brain, specifically what's happening in the makeup of who we are created to be, because God has wired us a specific way. And the temptations that are common to anyone are common to all men, right? All men and women. So we have to look at what's taking place. And I think it's important for parents and caring adults to really understand what's taking place in their kids' minds when they say things like, and the core problem, I would say, so if we get down to it, we really look at what's happening in the brain. It's despair. Despair is the problem. A utter place of hopelessness, that when somebody gets to a place of just, there's nowhere else to turn, they're at a place of despair. Now, the good news is that we can all empathize with despair, because we've all experienced a form of despair at some point in our life. Right. Whether it's a high amount of despair, maybe you've never been to a place where you've experienced so much despair where you've thought about ending your life. But chances are, if you're breathing longer than, a couple of years, if you're an adult, you've definitely faced despair. You've faced hardship. You've faced places where you're at the end of your rope and you're not sure how you're going to get through. You face deep amount of grief, and you've been there. So we can all empathize with despair. Now, somebody who's at a place of despair where they're voicing out that they don't want to live anymore, then that's a whole nother level of despair. So let me kind of show you what I have a couple of illustrations that explain kind of what's taking place in the brain.
Awesome.
But this is, is kind of a healthy brain. Now, Elizabeth, you're you're a student of psychology, so you know this is a way oversimplification of what the brain is. But for simplistic reasons,
Sure.
I'm going to break down the brain into just two pairs here. So we have the left
Love
side
it.
of our brain and the right side of our brain. And we're going to break these down as the left side is logical and the right side is emotional. Now, the right side is where predominantly a lot of your emotional processing takes place, like your fight or flight mechanisms. And under a healthy brain, you kind of have this back and forth. You feel something, you logically process it, it goes back over to emotional. And there's this back and forth processing that's really, really healthy, and it's really good. The problem is that
Right.
when we experience a large amount of despair, and as despair increases, a hormone called cortisol also increases, and our fight or flight mechanisms become overactivated. And this is how God's wired our
Right.
brains for good purposes. But things that are meant for good can sometimes be flipped into, dysfunctional or bad. And so over time, the fight or flight mechanisms become so high, blood flow shifts, and you almost have this despairing. Like, think of despair as a despairing of your emotional and logical processing. And this is a really difficult thing for anyone to face. It's emotional detachment. This is why somebody who's facing a large amount of despair, when you ask them how they're feeling, oftentimes the response is, I don't know. Or they might
Right.
say, I just feel numb. I can't tell you how many times I've sat across the table from a teenager and I asked them how they felt. And the answer was, I don't know. Or I feel numb. And they just feel so disconnected from their emotions. That is a huge indicator that despair is present in their life in that given moment. But here's the cool thing. The cool thing is yes, cortisol is a stress hormone that can become too activated, and we have too much of a drip, and it activates our emotional fight or flight. But there's also another hormone that God's given us, and it's called oxytocin. That is released naturally through human connection. And so when we experience love
Yes.
and empathy, something starts to take place in our brain, and the two sides begin to come back together. That brain begins to heal through love and empathy, and that we come back to a healthy processing from emotional to logic. And the number one person who has this kind of superpower to help the brain connect back together is parents. Because of the connection that's been there for a lifetime for a kid, parents have an ability better than anybody to help the brain come back to healthy connection. And all through this hormone, oxytocin. One way to put it is attunement. The psychology of attunement is the way to reconnect these two sides back together.
So I love that you talk about that disconnection and just the level of despair and the role that plays in thinking about suicide and some of those thoughts, because I feel like that's definitely my experience as a counselor as well, is the people, whether they're teenagers or adults or whoever it is, there's just a level of despair that they get to and a hopelessness that they feel. And I think that disconnection you're talking about in the brain that happens, it also disconnects us from the ability of feeling like we have any control over how we feel, like our decision-making processes and things like that. Because when I talk to people, who are struggling with thoughts of suicide, they a lot of times just don't want to continue living each day with how they're feeling. And they don't know how to change it. They don't feel like they can change it. They feel like something is broken within them. They feel like there's no options for them. And so that kind of becomes what they think is going to be the great escape for them from all that, and kind of their only option for that. So I think it's really important. And like you said, another caring person can really help someone get back in that right frame of mind in order to realize, hey, there are choices. There are things that you can do. There's hope. There's alternatives. And that actually, one of the other myths that I was wanting to talk about today, is we've kind of touched on a little bit already, but if you discuss suicide with someone, it will make him or her want to commit suicide even more. Almost like you're putting the thought in their mind. Like, right. If you see them as depressed or, struggling in some way, like it's this weird awkwardness of like, do I directly ask them about it? Because if I do, what if that gives them the idea, or, something like that? But that's why that's a myth of suicide, right? Is because actually
Right.
talking to someone about their feelings can help them connect those pieces of themselves that bring back that logical way of thinking and kind of get them out of that pit of emotional despair that they find themselves in. And so talking to people directly and just going, hey, I've noticed you're struggling. Like, has this been a thought that's crossed your mind? Have you been struggling with thinking about hurting yourself or ending your life? Like, has it gotten that bad that you're considering that? And sometimes directly asking someone about that, and opening up that conversation with them is exactly what they need in order to connect those pieces of themselves again and find that hope and kind of get themselves out of that despair like we're talking about.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Conversation is the key to this whole thing. When we are able to put into words what we're feeling, we're moving that emotional energy over to logical processing, because our words and how we formulate words is really a logical process. It's done on the right or the left side of the brain, rather. So if we can take that emotional energy, move it into words, then we're really moving that energy over to process it out and to exhale it. I like to think of it like this. When you're dealing with teenagers who are in despair, or really anyone, it's almost as if you've taken a big, deep breath of air and you're unable to exhale. That's what despair is. They have all this emotion and they just don't know how to get it out. Like, how do you feel? I don't know. I feel numb. Like, so what we need to do as caring adults, as parents, we have to help them to emotionally exhale, to release that emotional energy. That's what brings the two sides back together and actually leads somebody from a place of despair to a place of healing.
I love that you mentioned that. I think that's such a good visual too, because we've all known what that's felt like, to just be full of emotion or full of that feeling that we just don't know how to offload that really, and I think another thing that is really important to talk about in terms of suicide is the tunnel vision that can happen. And I think that happens exactly when you're with what you're describing, as they are just overwhelmed with all of these thoughts and these feelings. They don't know what to do about it. They feel trapped by it. And they get to thinking that ending their life is the only option for them. And it becomes that tunnel vision of the only thing that they can see, the only thing that they can focus on. And that's it. And so sometimes just opening up that conversation is exactly what helps to break open that tunnel vision and to help them know that there are options for them. There is light, there is hope, there is moving beyond these things. I know one of your favorite quotes that I've heard you say a lot of times is not making permanent decisions based on temporary feelings, right? Can you tell us a little bit about that? How does that connect with thoughts of suicide and things like that?
The biggest lie that we start to believe when we are, in a high place of despair is that it's always going to be this way. The reality is it's not always going to be this way. It may feel like it's always going to be this way, but I promise you it won't always be this way. And let me say this to somebody who may be listening. You might be a parent and you're struggling with suicidal thoughts yourself. You might even be a church leader and you're struggling with suicidal thoughts yourself. You can't do this alone. And it's not because you're powerless, but it's because we were wired to need each other. And God has a way of helping us to come to a place of healing, and it's through connection. And so don't isolate and don't hold this by yourself. Reach out, because yes, it won't always be this way, but I'm not sure you're going to believe me just watching me on a screen or listening to my ears. But if you reach out to somebody that loves you and knows you, or just even the suicide hotline that can really empathize with you and help you to validate your feelings, that what you feel matters, but it doesn't necessarily conclude to what you conclude, is that there is hope and it won't always be this way. And don't make a permanent decision on a temporary problem, because there's light and there's hope and it's going to change. You just gotta stick it through. Tomorrow will be different eventually.
Yeah. I love that you said that too, because a lot of times we can't do it alone. And when we're that overwhelmed with our feelings, we're not thinking logically, like we just explained. And so our judgment is clouded. We're not thinking clearly. And a lot of times we need somebody else that cares about us, that knows us, to talk to us and to talk some sense into us and talk some logic to the emotions that we're feeling. And I want to encourage you too, if as believers, if you're listening to this and struggling with suicide, there's no shame in that either. We have to remember that there's a real enemy of our souls out there as well that is always trying to steal our joy, to destroy us. You know, the Bible tells us that he's literally lurking around like a lion trying to destroy us. And so one of his best tactics is to get us to believe and to convince us to think that we're worthless, that we serve no purpose, that the world would be better off without us, because that would be him winning that battle of stealing our purpose and our identity in Christ. And so sometimes we need another believer who can stand alongside of us and who can support us and lift us up while we're too clouded in our emotions to really be able to think about that clearly and to be able to process that. So I want to encourage you, if you are a believer that is struggling with feeling this way and there's shame connected to that as well for you, I would really especially encourage you to talk to somebody about it, because there is no shame. Like we mentioned earlier, this is something that affects a lot of people. Almost every person that has come into my counseling office from all different walks of life, all different experiences, has struggled with this at some point, or has also struggled with a family member or a friend or someone else that has committed suicide. So don't do it alone. Don't feel like you have to hide that. Talk to somebody about it and have that conversation. Another thing that I was thinking about too, that I wanted to mention about what we were talking about a few minutes ago. If you do, if you have someone in your life that has maybe talked about suicide or has kind of threatened the idea of suicide, and it seems to be an attention-seeking behavior, or maybe you do kind of think of suicidal talk as attention-seeking behavior and not taking it seriously, I would just encourage you to think about it from a different perspective as well. Of, that person may or may not be seriously thinking about a plan to harm themselves or have a means and a plan, but even if it is a cry for attention, that's a pretty significant cry for attention, right? I mean, if they are talking about ending their life and they're trying to figure out if anyone would care about that, that is a pretty significant cry for attention that needs to be taken seriously. So no matter who you are, if you're a parent, if you're a youth leader, whatever, if you are talking to somebody that is expressing thoughts or feelings of suicide, you need to take that seriously and you need to get them help. You need to make sure that they are connected with help and they are talking to someone. Doesn't mean that you necessarily have to lead them through every part of the process if you feel in over your head about that as well. But it's important to take it seriously, no matter if they've said it before, no matter if it's, maybe even been an ongoing thing. It's important to take it seriously every time something like that is said, and to connect people with the help that they need when they need it.
I like to think of it this way, that, when somebody's communicating that they're having thoughts of killing themselves or that they want to kill themselves, they're communicating a need. At the end of the day, even if it's an attention-seeking need, they're communicating a need, and there's a level of despair that's behind that need. So it necessitates attention to some degree. It necessitates at least empathy and a conversation. And so I would say, if somebody shares that with you, there is a difference between I'm having thoughts of killing myself, suicide ideation, and I have a plan to kill myself, which is a whole nother, side of things. And when somebody says that, regardless of what they say, whether it's ideation or a plan to kill themselves, I think the most important thing is to stay calm. Like, don't freak out. If you emotionally become unglued when somebody already feels emotionally unglued, that's not going to be helpful. The next thing is how you respond really, really matters. A lot of times as caring adults and loving people, we want to say things like, oh, honey, you shouldn't feel that way. You have so much to live for and you have so many good things. I mean, what about your mom, or, your grandma, Agnes loves you, and and you feel alone, but what about your best friend Chloe? And you have your
Right.
cat Stripey, and you're like, we name all these reasons why they shouldn't feel the way they feel. The
Yeah.
problem with that is when somebody is in a place of despair and then we tell them all the reasons why they shouldn't feel the way they feel, the actual emotion that we reinforce is guilt and shame. And
Hmm.
they come to the conclusion, see, I am broken. I shouldn't feel
Yep.
this way, but I do.
Yep.
And
Right.
so I think the best response, so parents, caring adults, here's your response. Here's what you just simply say. I hate that you feel the way you feel, and it hurts my heart and it makes me sad. But I want you to know I love you. That's it.
Right.
I love you. Empathize, express your emotion of what you feel, that you feel sad or that you hate that they're feeling this, not that you hate them, but you hurt because they hurt.
Yep.
Um, and empathize with the emotion, and then just simply say, I love you. And I'm going to be here. I'm going to walk through with you. Maybe ask a follow-up question, of, do you want to tell me more about how you feel? And,
Hmm.
if they say, I don't know how I feel, we'll say, well, do you feel ashamed? Do you feel alone? Do you feel embarrassed? Do you feel angry? Maybe they'll say, I feel all of them. And we'll pick one and tell me more. And
Right.
just getting them to say how they feel. And that simple sentence, by the way, I don't want to pass it. Tell me more is crucial.
Yes.
Listening is such a huge key in
Yep.
helping somebody to emotionally exhale. Because
Yep.
once they get onto the emotion that they feel, and you simply say, tell me more, they will start to tell you more and they will start to exhale the emotion if
Yep.
you're willing to listen. And ultimately, the goal is that you help them to feel felt. Because when somebody
Right.
feels felt, then they feel connected. And when they feel connected, you bring the two sides back together. It's pretty awesome.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. That is something I always, I've done some mentor training with church leaders and things like that in the past. And one of the things I always tell them, the most effective thing you can do is ask
Mm,
more questions, because also I know as a therapist too how valuable it is for people to just be able to verbalize what they're feeling and to be able to talk it through, and how a lot of times they work out conclusions or they just reveal what's going on, maybe even to themselves as they're processing through it. And once it's right there in front of you, then you can do something with it. Or once you've opened up to
yeah.
somebody else about it, there's accountability now that has entered into the equation. And so it's no longer you just struggling with these things in your head, but you've voiced them, you've invited another person into that process. And that's when some really great things can happen and can change. So if you are in a position that you are talking with someone about these feelings, exactly what Will was just saying, ask questions, ask them to keep talking, keep sharing with what they're feeling, because then they're really gonna be able to kind of get an emotional release from that, but also be able to share with you what's really in their heart so that you know how to better help them as
Yeah.
well. So I think that's great. And I think, we've touched on this a little bit already, but another myth is that if they've never mentioned suicide, that they're not suicidal. And
Mm,
that's absolutely not true. People handle this all sorts of different ways. Some people do talk about it to test people out in their lives and see how are they going to react to this. Will anyone care if I'm here or not? But some people will keep it to themselves and never say anything. So if you have someone in your life that is showing signs of depression, they're isolating, they're withdrawing, losing interest in things that they normally enjoy, just major changes in personality, not seeming like themselves anymore, giving away important possessions, saying goodbye, they start kind of doing bizarre things like that, that talking about it, it may seem obvious in the moment, but some of these behaviors aren't actually that obvious until maybe it's too late. So being
mm,
really aware of just the people in your lives, and if you know that they struggle with depression, if you know that they've struggled with some of these things in the past, and they're not seeming like themselves, ask them about it. They might be thinking about it, but they might not be sharing that with you. So once again, that circles back to what we were talking about, of just opening up that conversation, and the importance of just talking to people about their feelings and how that might be able to help them in that moment. Anything to add for that, Will, about maybe people that aren't as open about that?
Yeah, no, I think asking straight is always the best. And
Yeah,
sometimes we try to like, well, how do I ask this? And sometimes you just got to ask like, hey, are you having thoughts of hurting yourself, or are
right,
you thinking about killing yourself? And if the answer is no, they'll say no. But oftentimes, if they're feeling that or thinking that, they're not going to lie to you. They're going to
right,
tell you.
right.
And that's why the question is so important. And
Yeah,
like I said, if somebody answers that yes, be careful how you respond.
right.
Empathize with their emotion, and empathize with how they're feeling. Tell them you love them, and then stay on top of it. Like, help them get some help. The suicide hotline is a great resource. If you're like, I don't even know who to call, it's 11 o'clock at night, it's 2 a.m.
Yep.
Call that. There's crisis counselors that are really good in those moments, helping get on the other side, and then giving additional resources of how to move forward.
Yes. Yep. I love that. And Will, you even have a tool that you use that's an acronym that helps to, talk about these things. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I briefly mentioned it at the beginning of our talk, this idea of attunement psychology. And it's this idea of being in tune, to feel felt. If you think about your best friend, sometimes you'll say like, oh yeah, they're my best friend because they feel me, they get me, you feel this connection with somebody. Well, that's attunement at its finest. And so to really help decrease despair, attunement is one of the best tools. And so I break it down into 6 simple steps, that parents or caring adults can implement to help influence and lead somebody towards healing. And it's attune. So ATTUNE, attune, to help someone decrease despair. And I'm going to go through these briefly because if I explain them exhaustively, it would take another whole podcast.
Right.
Um, but the first one is to attend. And that just means to be present, that when somebody is expressing that they have a need, to be present. And we talked a lot about those be present principles already. The
Right.
next one is time. And you have to invest time to increase your talking, that
Right.
communication, the listening. And so spending time asking questions, listening is very, very, very important. And specifically, like I said, it's not necessarily for you to talk, but for them to talk by asking questions to emotionally exhale.
Right.
The next T is tone. So what we say matters, but how we say it matters even more, right?
I
There's
think
a big
that's my
difference.
favorite one.
Yes, it's so true. And
So good.
as stressed out parents, sometimes we can miss our tone. I know
Yep.
that from personal experience. I don't
Yep.
get it right all the time. I know these principles. I teach these principles. I still accidentally miss it when I'm in a high stress in the moment and I react at my kids, and I have to
Yep.
loop back around and fix the tone, right?
Yep.
But tone matters. And so we have to be aware of our tone. There's a big difference between I love you and I love you, right?
Yes. Right.
And so just how we say it. The next one is U, which is unplug. This is a hard principle to teach right now in the midst of a pandemic where everyone is well connected.
Yes.
But you start to see it even now where you hear people say, I have Zoom fatigue. Because here's what this season has taught us. Yes, we're able to continue to be productive. And yes, we're able to continue to have conversations, but we're still missing something in the digital space. And that is physical presence and physical contact. Now, Zoom helps because you can at least see my facial expressions. You can hear my tone. And there is a better connection than just on words alone. But
Right.
we're still missing something. We're missing the in between times. That's what we're missing. We're
Right.
missing the sitting in the same room with somebody and there's these 30 minutes of quiet, and all of a sudden I have a thought and I say, hey, blah, 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 right?
Right.
It's conversations. Conversations don't always come at structured times. Hey, we have a Zoom meeting at 2:30 and it's going to last for 30 minutes, but conversations happen, uh, you know, just in the context of presence. And we're
Right.
missing that.
Right.
And because we're missing it, we're missing a huge part of connection. Now,
Yep.
unplugging, though, means that we have to recognize that there has to be seasons or moments where we just connect with the people who are physically with us. For us in my household, there are specific times that we don't have any electronics. We call no phone zones. We have rooms, like there's a specific couch that we've kind of dictated as like, this is a no electronic couch. So if somebody's sitting on that couch, you can come and sit. So if dad's sitting on that couch, you can come and sit and talk with me, but you
Yeah.
can't, there's no phones allowed.
Yeah.
And the dinner table is another one of those places. And so
Right.
we've just tried to create this rhythm of times and places where we just simply unplug to create space for conversations and connection. The last two, I'll hit them quicker than I did the first couple, but the last
Oh,
two
good stuff.
are notice. Notice means to specifically notice the emotion. So
Yeah.
um, meet right brain with right brain, meet left brain with left brain. In other words, when you have a kid who's emotionally activated, meet them first with emotion. You know, if they're distraught because they failed their test, instead of saying, well, of course you failed your test, you didn't study when I told you to study, and you know, now you live and learn, do better next time. That's logical processing. But if they're emotionally activated and they're way up here, you hit them with logical, you kind of miss over it, and
Right.
you don't connect. So
Right.
first say, oh, that really stinks. I hate that you failed your test. I bet you feel really, really embarrassed, or maybe you feel angry. Yeah, I do. I feel
Mhm.
angry. My dumb teacher, blah, 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 did this. And oh, I can tell that, you know, that hurts. In the back of your mind as a parent, you're thinking, this is so dumb. Of course you failed your test. You didn't study. This is your fault. But just empathize with the emotion first,
Yeah.
then
Don't
loop
say
back
that. That's not
around.
gonna help.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no. Loop back around later though and give the logical. You know, say,
Yeah.
hey,
Yep.
when the emotion comes back down to neutral, say, hey, what do you think? Is there anything you could have done differently that maybe would have influenced your grade? You know,
Yeah.
and so that logical processing, just don't try to hit it right away, especially if they're emotionally activated. So notice
Yeah.
the emotion. Meet right brain with right brain, left brain with left brain. And the last one, this is
Yep.
my favorite, is E, and it stands for eye contact. That research is showing us more and more and more the power of eye contact.
Yes.
God has wired our brains to respond to eye contact, especially with a parent or somebody that already has a connection, that when we go face to face, the brain remembers early childhood and nurturing centers, and it reroutes back to safety places. And so some of the best things you can do, especially if you're a parent and you know, you have a kid who's in despair, some of the best things you can do is just grab them by the head and kind of put your thumbs on their temple. Because think about when they were a baby, you held them and you put your hand on their face and the side of their face, and you looked them in the eye, and you affirmed them, and you spoke just these words of affirmation. So physical touch, eye contact, and appropriate physical touch can quickly influence
Yeah.
the brain to feel safe in the midst of high crisis. And so eye contact is a very powerful tool, along
Yes.
with appropriate physical touch. And nobody does that better than a parent. Caring adults,
Yeah.
you got to be careful. Appropriate physical touch can trigger someone towards trauma. But parents
Yeah.
oftentimes have the ability to help reroute the brain back to safety places.
Yes. That's so good. I love that acronym. I think that's it's so useful and it's so practical, and really it's simple in the fact that those are things that you could immediately start doing when,
Yes.
you know, your teenager or a friend or whoever it is starts expressing some of these feelings to you. And I think that's sometimes where we get trapped in helping people, is going, I don't know, like these are big emotions, these are big things that they're feeling, I don't know how to handle that. But that's such a practical and kind of simple list of things that we can do in that moment to help them. And so I think that's really great.
Yeah.
And I think even what I hear listening to some of that is, it's honestly about shifting your attention to what they're feeling in that moment and giving
Right.
them what they need in that moment. It's not about what you're feeling necessarily. It's not about what you're processing, because you are going to feel things, you know, especially as a parent or someone that's very closely connected to someone expressing these feelings. There's a lot that's going to rise up in you in a reaction to your child or your friend, you know, expressing some of these things. But it's important to remember to focus on what they're feeling. Ask for more information, you know, about what they're feeling, and try to put aside even some of the things that you're feeling in that moment to be able to connect with the need that really they're asking for in that moment. And that's such a great, useful way to really help them in that moment. So I think that's
Yeah.
awesome. It's really good. The last thing I wanted to touch on is almost like a little added bonus to kind of talking about these myths, because this is honestly something that comes up a lot when talking about suicide. It's also the issue of cutting. And
Mm.
I think that there's a myth that all people who struggle with self-harm also struggle with suicide. And that's not always necessarily true. Sometimes the two do go hand in hand, but sometimes not. Cutting is a lot of times just a negative coping skill. that allows for feelings of control. Sometimes it's a way of just feeling like they need to be able to control something, and that's what, what they can do. There are actual endorphins that are released when we're in pain, that can actually fight some of those feelings, but it's a negative coping skill that they've learned to deal with the emotion that they're feeling. So despair, feeling overwhelmed, hopelessness, and sometimes that is their reaction to it. So if you have a student or a friend or a child that is struggling with self-harm in some way, which that also can look, very different from person to person. I think all of the things that we have talked about today is a great way to open up that conversation with them as well, directly asking them questions about it, paying attention to what they're thinking, asking to tell you more about what they're feeling and what they're experiencing. And a lot of, those attuned tools, those are great methods to help, because even though some of the motivation behind those behaviors might be different, empathy, love, care, expressing those things is exactly what they need in that as well. So
Yeah.
just wanted to touch on that because it comes up a lot. But anything to add as far as cutting goes? I don't know if you have some experience with that as well in this topic.
It goes back to the emotional exhale that
Yeah,
at the end of the day, you have a high amount of emotional energy that's really trying to figure out a way to get out.
right.
And so, in some ways, it can come out through cutting. And to
Yep.
your point, the endorphins help kind of sidestep that. So it's coping, but it doesn't necessarily equate and co-align with suicide.
Right.
So you're right about that. And then the last thing I would say, because there might be parents that are listening and maybe they have a child who's cutting or a child who's struggling with despair or depressive symptoms.
Right.
And sometimes they can hear talks like this and think, I'm a bad parent because I didn't do these, or well, I don't respond all the time to my kid the right way, and I shouldn't have yelled at him, and I should have blah 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 blah. And we can kind of listen to this and feel like we've failed. And I just want you to know, if you're a parent and you're listening, you have a kid that's going through some tough stuff, that it's not your fault, and that these tools that we're giving you aren't to blame you or to try to convict you and tell you that you did something wrong, but rather empower you and let you know that your love matters.
Yes.
And these are simple tools to express that love, but your love matters. And wherever you are now, just start, take one step. Maybe it's eye contact, and maybe, you take 30 seconds a day just to look at your kid and look them in the eye and just tell them how much they mean to you. Maybe it's that, you start just doing some of your work with them, in their bedroom. I think about a dad who, found out that his son was dealing with some really, dark thoughts about suicide. And he just decided, you know what, if you're feeling the way you're feeling, I'm going to come and just be present, because I just don't want you to be alone while you feel the way that you feel. And so he started
Yeah.
doing his work on his laptop while his son was doing his homework in his room, and he was just present. And so just take a
Awesome.
step and just know that what you do matters, that your love matters, and
Yep.
you don't have to feel guilt. It's not your fault. And even if your kid, maybe you're listening, you've had a kid who's completed suicide, it's not your fault. And the hardest thing about life is that we can't control the actions of the people that we love, but we can do what we can do, which is just continue to love them and help influence the best we can for the brain to heal and come back to a place of hope.
I love that. It's all about focusing on that next step. I think that's exactly right. We don't have to figure out the whole plan. We don't have to have every piece. We don't have to have every skill. We just need to focus on the next step and how we can help someone. So,
Yeah.
Will, thank you so much just for joining me today and talking about this. And I think we talked about some really good things, and hopefully everyone listening just feels a little bit more equipped to reach out if you are struggling with feelings of despair or suicide, or maybe you're thinking of someone and someone has come to mind during this conversation that you need to check on and you need to reach out to. So we would encourage you to do that, and hopefully after this you feel a little bit more equipped and able to do that. But thank you so much for joining us. We will also put the suicide hotline number in the description of this video as well, so that is available to you. But thank you for joining us, and make sure you catch us next week as we are we're talking about how to practice joy and gratitude, and how that can actually help us with a lot of what we've been talking about today, feelings of depression, feelings of despair, and how we can find hope in that as well. So thanks again, and make sure to join us next week.